Please welcome Michael Abrash to the stage.
Wow. I could never have imagined anything like this 3 years ago when I started down the path to VR, and it's fantastic. I'm super excited to be talking to you today, so let's dive in and talk about VR, the future, and you. I think we've all had the experience of walking out of a great science fiction movie or finishing a great science fiction book and thinking, why can't real life be like that? So here's an interesting question. What is it that science fiction has that real life doesn't have? To me, it's the sense that the future hinges in important ways on individual actions. Isn't that what we all want? To matter, to make our mark on the world, and to change the future for the better? Consider the three novels that I think of as the touchstones of VR and AR: Snow Crash, Ready Player One, and Rainbow's End. Snow Crash is about the battle over Sumerian biolinguistic viruses, which basically means control of the entire world. Ready Player One is about the battle for control of Oasis, which basically means control of the entire world. And Rainbow's End is about the battle over you gotta believe me mind control, which basically means control of the entire world. And do I even need to mention the Matrix? Of course, none of us are going to wake up tomorrow and find ourselves stopping bullets in midair or kung-fuing with Agent Smith, but we, all of us in this room, are among the most fortunate people on Earth because we have the opportunity right now to change the future in a big way, an opportunity that not one person in 1,000 has in their lifetime. Each of us has been hardworking, smart, and lucky enough to have a front row seat as VR becomes real, and to be in a position to help make it real. And you are more critical to making that future happen than you might imagine. Consider John Carmack and the genesis of network 3D gaming. In 1994, John and I had dinner at this Thai restaurant in Bellevue. I knew John was going to offer me a job at id, and I knew I was going to turn it down because I was doing important work on Windows NT at Microsoft. And John did indeed offer me that job. But before he did, he talked for a couple of hours about his vision of the future, in which anyone could build persistent worlds on the internet, and anyone could jump into and between those worlds, and a kind of cyberspace would accrete from the actions of a whole community. By the time he was done, I knew I had to join John to make that happen. And happen it did in a big way, which brings us to the key question. Would it have happened the same way without John? What if John had just churned out more Doom-style games, rather than seeing the potential of the internet for client-server gaming and moving to full 3D? What if he hadn't had a strong philosophy of openness, if he hadn't shared his techniques freely, if he hadn't encouraged modding? Would the world of network 3D gaming have been the same? To me, it's obvious that things would have worked out very differently. If you think otherwise, I'd say you've fallen for what Ottman Binstock calls the myth of technological inevitability, the idea that just because technology is possible, it will just naturally happen. In point of fact, the future depends on the actions of individuals and can follow wildly diverging paths depending on those actions. If John hadn't done Quake, not only gaming, but quite possibly GPUs themselves would have been very different. If Steve Jobs hadn't come back to Apple, who knows what cell phones would be like? And if Palmer Luckey hadn't prototyped the Rift, VR wouldn't be on the verge of taking off, and we wouldn't be gathered here today. But Palmer did do that, and VR is about to happen. You, likewise, have a remarkable opportunity to alter the course of the future. VR is potentially the biggest transformation in our relationship with technology, at least since the personal computer, and possibly much more. It's the completion of a path that started with the invention of language and drawing, and continued with writing, printing, telephony, radio, movies, television, and computer games. VR will finally allow us to interact with information in the way we're built to interact with reality. But there is no inevitability to how that happens, how long it takes, or how it alters our lives. VR is coming, but the path it takes depends on the actions of a few thousand key people, potentially including you. That may be hard to believe, but I'm completely serious. Working on VR is probably the closest any of us will ever come to living in a science fiction novel. Having said that, this seems like a good time at which to insert the official most famous VR photo ever. Partly because this happens to be my cousin, Sally Rosenthal. But also to remind ourselves of how often VR has been touted to take off in the past, and how consistently that has failed. Why is it going to be different this time? Let's start with what Chris Anderson called the peace dividend of the smartphone war. Good enough VR requires a sizable number of aspects to be above the bar simultaneously. If even one isn't good enough, the experience just won't come together. These aspects include optics, calibration, ergonomics, rendering, and optical tracking, all of which are tractable for small teams with relatively modest budgets. But there's also a need for small, lightweight, high-resolution screens, along with tiny, accurate, high-frequency gyroscopes and accelerometers, and those are definitely not tractable without very considerable resources. No one has ever been willing to spend billions of dollars to develop those technologies just to find out if there was a VR market. But many companies have been willing to spend that kind of money in order to develop the smartphone market. Similarly, development of GPUs powerful enough to handle the warping needed to correct for fisheye lenses and to handle the heavy rendering demands of VR happened courtesy of the game industry. And tiny, inexpensive cameras were likewise developed for other purposes. The second reason is that consumer VR good enough to be broadly successful is clearly within reach. The DK2 is a big step down that path, but there's a lot more going on right now in both VR and AR, which share a lot of the same technology. Google's working on Glass, Sony's doing Morpheus, Valve's done some great prototyping work, Technical Illusions is doing cast AR, there are many companies doing cell phone AR, and there have been hints of other major projects that are running dark. These are not isolated or wishful efforts. There's a full-on race to establish the next big platform, be it AR or VR, and a tremendous amount of horsepower is being brought to bear on optics, tracking, and small displays. VR-related technology is driving forward, and it won't be long before we have an existence proof for consumer VR. An existence proof changes everything, something I learned long ago. Back when I worked at Microsoft, I wrote what I think was my third serious software rasterizer. The key code was the texture mapping loop, just a dozen or so instructions that consumed something like half the entire time when running a game. Obviously, there was tremendous leverage to removing even one instruction from the loop, so I went over the code again and again until I was sure it was completely optimized. Then, just in case I had missed something, I ran it by my friend David Stafford, a superb optimizer. David said he didn't see anything off the top of his head, but he'd think about it, and he'd let me know. When I got home that evening, there was a message from David saying he had gotten not one, but 2 instructions out of my loop. I called him back, but I couldn't get hold of him, so I started thinking about what he might have done to get those 2 instructions out. Thought about it during dinner, I thought about it while I brushed my teeth, I thought about it when I should have been sleeping. And eventually, I did manage to eliminate 1 instruction from that loop, but I just couldn't get the second one. That bothered me all night, and it bothered me the next day, right up until the moment when I got hold of David, at which point he said, oh, by the way, there was a bug in my code. David hadn't figured out how to get even 1 cycle out of the loop, but I had. So think about that for a second. I was sure I had an optimal solution, but just believing that someone had a better solution, even though they actually didn't, enabled me to break through my preconceptions and do something I had thought was impossible. That's how it's going to be for VR. Once great consumer VR is shown to be possible and is shipping in quantity, many companies, both hardware and software, are suddenly going to become believers. Increased competition and investment in VR will result in more innovation and better VR experiences, which will lead to broader uptake, which will lead to more investment, resulting in a virtuous cycle, just as happened with smartphones. All it will take to kick this off is consumer VR hardware good enough to spur widespread adoption, and we're almost there. And then, of course, there is Facebook's $2 billion acquisition of Oculus, which guarantees that VR is going to get the resources and the runway that it needs to prove itself. So VR will have plenty of time and resources, can leverage work done for cell phones and other industries, is right on the verge of being technically good enough, and will kick off a virtuous cycle once it starts to be successful. That answers the question of why VR can be successful this time around. but it doesn't answer the question of what it is about VR that's so compelling that it will be successful. There are many possible places to start that discussion, but I think the best place to begin is with my first meeting with Mark Zuckerberg. To jump right to the punchline, no pun intended, here's how I looked the next day. I should make it clear that while this is in fact how I looked after meeting Mark, Mark had nothing to do with causing this. What's interesting, though, is what did cause it. Here's what I reconstructed after the fact. I'd been waiting for the meeting in a conference room. About 10 minutes before the meeting, I got up, left the room, walked around for a bit, then headed back. The conference room's interior wall consisted of floor-to-ceiling relights, like this, with a door at the end. Deep in thought, I walked toward the door, with the relights passing by on my right. Now, when I say deep in thought, I mean really deep in thought. I wasn't consciously paying any attention to where I was going. That doesn't mean I was wandering randomly, though. Without consciously thinking about it, I had handed navigation over to a simple processor, operating below the conscious level. The instructions for that processor were as follows. Keep walking until you come to the last rectangle on the right that has light coming through it. That will be the door, so turn right. Straightforward enough, and pretty much foolproof. Unless someone had shut the door since I had left, which they had. I walked headfirst into that last relight and bounced, producing a sound a lot like a 180-pound person walking into a glass panel, which mercifully was capable of withstanding a 3-mile-per-hour impact. I think they heard me out on the 101. I quickly learned that Facebook security people are really, really good at first aid. They got the bleeding stopped quickly. I successfully told them what day it was and where I was. And the meeting went ahead without a hitch, although Mark does remind me of it every time I see him. So that's a story I can tell for the rest of my life anytime I need to embarrass myself. But it's also a nice lead-in to the core reason I think VR will actually succeed this time around, which is that VR drives the human perceptual system in the way it's built to be driven. As a result, VR can produce experiences that feel deeply real, and that will result in a fundamental change in the way we interact with technology. The key to this is understanding that while we think our conscious minds experience reality, in truth, they don't interact with reality at all. What they do interact with is a hierarchy of processors that operate at an unconscious level, like the one that steered me into the relight, which then deliver their best guess at what's out there in the real world based on the input they've received. Importantly, this data shows up as things we just know. We believe them at a deep level that's often impossible to override consciously. For instance, try to look at this slide and not see an impossible object, but rather just shapes and lines and edges with no overall structure or meaning. I bet you can't do it, because your visual system is doing that work well below the conscious level. Object identification is already complete by the time the information reaches your conscious mind, and it appears to you as something you just know with such certainty that you don't even have a way to question it. Here's another example that provides experimental evidence of how powerfully unconscious processing creates our sense of reality. Take a moment to figure out which of the on-screen images of these two spheres is larger. To be clear, I'm talking about 2D size, not 3D. To me, and to most people, it's obvious that the farther circle is larger. However, this is a scene with a number of distance cues, forced perspective, distance blur, shadows, lighting, that imply that the farther sphere, considered as an object in a 3D scene, is farther away than it would be without those cues. The farther away it is, the larger its 3D size must be relative to its size on the screen. The brain factors those cues into your perception of size long before the images reach your consciousness. In fact, as you can see here, the two 2D circles are exactly the same size. The surprising finding here is that fMRI studies show that the farther sphere has a larger projection on the visual cortex. That is to say, even in the brain's lowest level model of the image on the retina, the visual system's representation of the farther sphere is already larger than that of the closer one, long before it reaches conscious control. The visual system integrates all of the data available to it and alters the relative sizes, and that is the reality that we experience. We might as well be brains hooked up to wires in glass jars for all that we truly experience reality. Our reality is nothing more or less than the sum of the conclusions reached by a variety of unconscious processors, driven by a body's worth of sensors. Our coherent view of the world emerges from the integration of the outputs of those processors in the lower levels of our brain. That might sound obvious, but because it's perceptual, the only way to truly understand what it implies is to experience it. For me, that experience came standing on a virtual ledge in the Valve demo room. I don't like heights, and to my surprise, my knees locked up and I had the same sense of unease on that ledge as I do looking over the edge of a real cliff. Consciously, I knew I was nowhere near a drop of any kind, but enough of my unconscious processors were convinced so that I had exactly the same reaction as if I had been. I could make myself step off the ledge, but it required a lot of conscious effort, and what I couldn't do was convince my body of what I knew for a fact, which was that I was in no danger. To me, the reality was that I was standing on a ledge, regardless of what my conscious mind thought. This is what the term presence means, that your perceptual system believes the virtual experience at a fundamental level. I'd love to give you a more precise definition, but because presence is a perceptual phenomenon, all I can do is quote Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart and say, I know it when I see it. I'm sure many of you have experienced presence to at least some degree, so you'll understand how powerful it is and why it's so hard to define. And if you haven't experienced it, the Crescent Bay demo today could be an eye-opener. Unfortunately, I can't give each of you the ledge experience right this moment, but I would like to give you an example of how your perceptual system constructs reality for you. So let's take a look at something called the McGurk effect. Here we have a video of someone saying the phoneme bar.
Bar, 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 bar.
Unsurprisingly, what we hear is bar. Now let's make it more interesting. Suppose the sound is of someone saying bar, but the visuals are of someone saying far. What sound do you think we'll hear?
Bar, 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 bar.
Astonishingly, we hear far, a sound which doesn't actually exist. In case you don't believe that the audio is actually far, let's look at another video. As this video plays, move your eyes back and forth between the two halves of the screen. As you do so, you will hear the sound change, even though the only sound in this room is bar.
Bar, 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 bar.
It's impossible to make the case that we're experiencing reality with the McGurk effect, because the sound we hear simply isn't present. Fourier analysis of the audio would really reveal no trace of the sound bar. What's happening here is that the senses, including hearing and vision, are unreliable. So the perceptual system constantly has to make clear judgments from noisy signals. And this is its best guess in this case. The sound we heard in this video was inarguably nothing more or less than a signal from the speech recognition center. No more a reflection of acoustic reality than if it was produced by applying an electrode directly to your brain. The McGurk effect is just one of a long list of visual, auditory, tactile, and kinesthetic illusions that expose the underlying mechanisms of our perceptual system. And it is those mechanisms that construct the reality we experience. If they're driven properly, as they were when I stood on that ledge, they can be made to report any reality we're capable of experiencing. And it is precisely that ability to drive the perceptual system directly that makes VR uniquely powerful and compelling. Of course, it's hard to hear that and not think of the Matrix. Maybe that's somewhere in the far future, but I don't expect anything like that in my lifetime. We don't have anything close to the understanding, let alone the technology, that would be required to make that work. What can now work is understanding the key cues and driving enough parts of the perceptual system from the outside, through the eyes, ears, skin, and so on, to create experiences that induce presence, the sense that you actually are someplace, rather than just looking at a picture of someplace. It's just barely possible right now, but that's enough. Using VR to drive the perceptual system directly is far more revolutionary than it seems. It's not just pasting up bigger and better images like a 360-degree IMAX theater. It's a difference of kind. Traditional media present images and sounds that are descriptions of experiences. Done properly, VR presents experiences directly, in the way that our bodies have evolved to accept information. If I had seen a movie of someone standing on a ledge, that would have been one thing. I would have understood what was going on, I might have had an emotional reaction, and so on. But standing on a ledge in virtual reality was another matter entirely, because as far as my unconscious was concerned, it was actually happening to me. Once again, this is a perceptual matter. So it's hard to explain except by putting you in a VR headset, but think of the McGurk effect, where you experienced a sound that didn't exist, and then extrapolate that to full immersion. Or think of it as the difference between showing you this picture and letting a tiger loose in this room. I'm pretty confident I know which of those two events would more fully engage your perceptual system. The bottom line is that VR isn't just another platform, because it's information driving the perceptual system the way it's built to be driven. It's an entirely different and more powerful way to interface with information in computers than we're used to, and in a very real sense, it's the final platform, the one that wraps our senses and will ultimately be able to deliver any experience that we're capable of having. At this point, I hope I've convinced you that VR is potentially a hugely important technology that's about to become widely used. I realize, though, that some of you may be thinking that I've drunk too much of my own Kool-Aid. I'm confident that if you're still a skeptic, that's because you haven't yet experienced real presence. My prediction is that you'll retain that skepticism right up to the day you use a VR system that does induce strong presence for you and have your own ledge experience, and then you'll understand. And the Crescent Bay demo today could make that today that day. Okay, you may or may not be convinced, but it's my belief that now that VR is technically doable, economically feasible, and capable of driving the human perceptual system convincingly enough to transport you to virtual worlds, in all likelihood, VR will take off in a big way over the upcoming years. So what does that mean for you? In a word, opportunity. This is like when John and I started on Quake, but on steroids. Pretty much everything still needs to be figured out. The killer app for VR hasn't been created yet. You could be the one to come up with it and start the next great genre. Likewise, VR art, animation, and game design are ripe for invention. Even the mechanics of VR have yet to be invented. I remember when John came up with mouse look, and no one knew which way it should move your viewpoint. Strafing, HUDs, movement speeds, everything that had to be figured out for FPSs will have to be figured out again for VR, and much, much more. Consider graphics. Right now, graphics is a mature area featuring steady but incremental improvement. The graph of effort and sophistication in versus perceived result out over time looks something like this. VR is going to do this to that curve. The reason that graphics is going to have to up its game in a hurry is that because VR engages so much more of the perceptual system than a monitor does, it's held to a much higher standard. Parallax, accurate positioning, wide field of view, and stereo vision together provide vastly more information to the perceptual system, which responds very strongly to VR done right, and complains just as strongly about VR that isn't quite right. And the trick is that right now, no one knows what it is that will make VR graphics great, and many of the tried and true rules of screen graphics no longer apply in VR. For example, aliasing is much worse in VR because the aliasing mismatches between the two eyes introduce stereo disparity, which is far more apparent and disturbing than mere jaggies on a screen. This is particularly noticeable with specular highlights. Similarly, faceting is much easier to see, so geometric detail becomes more important. All the more so because tricks used to fake geometric detail often look laughably wrong. Texture maps sometimes work, but sometimes look like painted plywood, and bump map surfaces simply don't look right. What all this means is that we're all going to have to invent new rendering, art, and animation approaches that work well in VR, and rethink tool pipelines, and eventually GPU architectures to match. Graphics is also going to have to up its game because VR's rendering demands are considerable. In order to avoid blur, great VR requires strobe pixel illumination, as Brendan mentioned. Then in order to completely eliminate flicker from strobing, it requires a 90 Hz frame rate in stereo, effectively about 6 times the rendering rate of current games. What's more, as I'll discuss shortly, those demands ramp up enormously over time. I can summarize VR graphics in 4 words: a lot more everything. We're going to need higher quality graphics, we're going to need more graphics, and we're going to need faster graphics. Hardware and software throughout the pipeline will have to change massively, causing a reevaluation of the techniques that have been worked out so carefully over the last 30 years. For a while, graphics will be the Wild West again, as a slew of experiments get run to figure out the new graphics sweet spots for the VR world. That shouldn't be surprising. It's what happens every time there's a major hardware shift. Many years ago, John noted that when the hardware platform changes, it opens up new opportunities for software, things that were simply not possible before. For example, CD-ROM drives enabled Myst, and the Wii controller enabled Wii Sports. With VR, we're about to make one of those hardware changes in a big way, and we're all going to have a crazy, exciting time over the next few years figuring out what's now possible thanks to the Rift. And it's not going to stop there. Consider how technology enabled the evolution of first-person shooters over time. Fast enough CPUs enabled Wolfenstein 3D. Faster CPUs and peer-to-peer networking enabled Doom. Still faster CPUs and the internet enabled Quake. And ever more powerful GPUs enabled Quake 2 and its successors. VR is going to be like that. Given the right combination of hardware and software, every aspect of VR will improve hugely over time. Of course, the VR platform isn't going to advance on its own. Someone has to make that happen. That someone is Oculus Research. We're putting together a broad mix of researchers, engineers, and programmers to form the first complete, well-funded VR research team in close to 20 years. We have the full backing of Oculus and Facebook for doing the deep, long-term work needed to make VR as good as it can be. Our mission is to keep advancing the VR platform so that you can develop new, great VR experiences on top of it. And we're fully aware that VR is more than just Oculus. We'll be publishing our findings and working with university researchers so the whole VR community can grow and move forward. So let's take a quick look at some of the ways in which we think we and others can make VR much better over time. Bear in mind, though, that this is research, so that there are no guarantees. Improving visual quality is the obvious place to start. The Rift DK2's resolution is about a megapixel per eye, spread over a field of view of 100 degrees, which means that the pixel density is very low indeed. Less, in fact, than the original Quake running on a monitor at 320 by 200 resolution. To get the same pixel density per degree as a modern desktop monitor, you'd need more than 50 times as many pixels, something on the order of 8K by 8K per eye. Achieving retinal resolution would require somewhere in the neighborhood of 16K by 16K. And that's with a 100-degree field of view. The full dynamic field of view of the human eye is on the order of 200 by 150 degrees, taking us to something like 32K by 24K resolution per eye. That means that eye tracking will almost certainly be a part of the future of VR. We wouldn't actually draw anything close to 32K by 24K pixels. We take advantage of the steep drop in resolution away from the fovea, the tiny high-resolution area of the retina, to render only as much resolution as the eye can detect. But, of course, we need to know where the fovea was pointed every frame, which means we'll need to integrate eye tracking with new display, optics, GPU, and rendering technology in order to make a truly great VR visual experience possible. We'll also be looking at depth of field. In order to explain this, let me define a couple of terms. The word vergence refers to how the eyes cross to provide stereo vision. The closer the object of interest, the more cross the eyes need to be. Accommodation, on the other hand, refers to how the lens of the eye deforms to allow you to focus at different distances. Most existing head-mounted displays support stereo images that allow for correct vergence, but all head-mounted displays that I'm aware of support only one focal depth for all objects in a scene, usually placing everything at near infinite focal depth. Immersion in a scene in which all objects are accommodated at infinity is not perceptually ideal, because the accommodation and vergence reflexes are linked. The lack of proper depth of field can cause discomfort, can prevent stereo fusion, and may make VR feel subtly less real. There are several possible ways in which this might be addressed, but one thing they all have in common is that they require new hardware and significant changes to the rendering model. Once the visuals are good enough, many other areas take on new importance in VR, including tracking, audio propagation and spatialization, input, user experience, haptics, and perceptual psychology. I wish I had time today to talk about the tremendous potential for all those areas in VR. But one particularly exciting area is scene capture and reconstruction. VR is going to need a great deal of realistic content, and the most promising base for that is deconstructing and reconstructing the real world. Over time, this will evolve to incorporate dynamic elements such as weather, lighting, scraps of paper blowing in the wind, cars, and, of course, people. That brings us to what I think will be the core of VR. Once we have virtual places to be in, we'll want to see ourselves and others in that space. Sensors that can capture the interpersonal cues humans key off of, head pose, eye movement, facial expression, hand gesture, body posture and movement, and then map them onto avatars in real time, will enable social interaction in these virtual spaces. Bell Labs used to talk about enabling any two people on the face of the earth to communicate, a powerful vision that has pretty much come true. Now imagine anyone on the face of the earth being able to be anywhere, with anyone, doing anything, whenever they want. Humans are highly social creatures, and I believe that sharing virtual spaces with other people will ultimately be the most powerful and widely used aspect of VR. VR is about driving the perceptual system. The more of it, the better, so eventually it will involve all the senses: audio, tactile, balance, kinesthetic, maybe even smell and taste. The entire body will become the sensor, not just the eyes, and the display will consist of not just pixels, but of everything that drives perception. VR also includes the other part of the perceptual loop, interaction as well as sensing. So it will include the ability to manipulate the virtual world as well. Over time, VR will wrap more and more of our perceptual system and will truly become a personalized alternate reality. It'll be many years before that transformation is complete, but VR is already changing what is possible, just as new hardware long ago enabled Myst, Doom, and Quake. Soon, there will be VR games, apps, and experiences that will revolutionize the way we interact with information and with each other. We're building the platform, but what those games, apps, and experiences will be is for you to decide. Imagine you had a pair of enchanted goggles that could teleport you to any place you could imagine. Where would you go? What would you do? It's a powerful thought, and that's exactly the magic that VR makes possible. Right now, we're at the very beginning of the VR revolution, and ahead of us lies a long, incredibly exciting time of groundbreaking research and development by smart, talented people, people like you. At Oculus, we're all in on building the VR platform, but that's only part of the picture. It takes a whole community working on top of that platform to make VR happen. This is what it looks like when opportunity knocks. I hope you'll take this rare chance to shape the future and come along on the adventure of a lifetime as we make science fiction real. Thank you. So let me just say that the energy in this room around VR is unbelievable. I never thought I would have a day like this, so it's fantastic. So to get back to the real world, be back here around 11:30 for John Carmack's talk.